Okay. Good morning. Beautiful morning it is. Nice to see you all here. I'm very excited about the events to come. My name is Johannes von Moltke. I'm the interim director of the International Institute in which we're meeting today. And before I say some thank yous, I thought I'd take a minute to frame this institutional location, what it means to be doing this inside an international institute, and maybe provide one personal quick reflection that struck me this week in thinking about the event we're going into. So like many of these institutes, the International Institute comes out of an area and regional studies model that we owe largely to the Cold War, but also to decolonization and the post-colonial situation, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, lends itself incredibly well to an America-centric view of the world, right? So that the idea is we gather knowledge about the world in order to better rule it, not to put a too fine a point on it, which obviously is an approach that we want to rethink, unthink, critique, even as we recognize the importance of continuing to generate regional and area studies knowledge. So we have 16 centers in the II, of which most are regional and area studies centers, including the ones that have invited you here today, and some of them are clustered under Department of Education funding as well, as national resource centers. I was thinking in the wake of the election and the run-up to the election in November that the II is now particularly well suited to get us out of the navel gazing that an election such as this one can produce, and had thought that it would be great if the II could, as a whole, organize some events and some thinking around decentering the US perspective on the most recent elections. And then somebody joked back to me and made me stop and think, so you're saying let's stop talking about ourselves and have the world talk about us instead. And I said, okay, that's not exactly what I was thinking, but fair point. And then I heard about this event, and that Kunāl had developed some ideas. Majumder and Youngju had been thinking in this direction. We have this Asia in the Headlines running a program. And I thought, oh, this is exactly what we need, and it actually does the work that I guess, standing in this position right now is what I'm most proud of in the II, of being actually not in the area studies mold or the old Cold War, but thinking in a multipolar world from a transnational perspective, one that actually no longer asks, did this originate here or there, bounce there or there, but how do things actually co-originate in space? What happens when you put multiple regions together in one space and start talking with each other and across divisions that otherwise are still kind of sequestered in the older area studies model? So that's my way of saying thank you for organizing this. I think it's really right up the alley of what the II should be doing. There's going to be more programming like this in the II. The Center for Emerging Democracies is doing something in its kind of lane next month, and we'll try to feature that as well. And then I thought I'd just share one image from last week that struck me in particular in this context. If we could just show this. There it goes. Which this is from Korea, and I'm certainly no expert in Korea. I'm looking forward to learning about Korea. But when I saw this, and I do some work on the cultural politics of the far right, when I saw this, some of us were talking over dinner last night over influence, meddling, how things travel from one national or regional context to another. And this, I think, really confounds that in the sense that I don't think this is not like Elon Musk going to Germany and saying, you have to vote AfD. This is people picking up a symbol that is floating around, a signifier floating around in mediated space. I think we're in a, obviously also compared to when an II was founded, we're in a completely different media situation, which makes crossing national boundaries completely different. And is not on the model of influence or colonization or the expression of regional power, but strikes me as needing other frameworks for explaining it. I don't have them, but I think it stands to reason that they need to be transnational. They need to think on the level of people, of media use, of emboldening, and also of a global rightward shift that seems marked by a politics of grievance by the people in power, right? Which I mean, those are all paradigms that I think are not, they don't come naturally. They need new thinking, and I'm really excited to have all of you here. I want to welcome the people who traveled for this, and I want to thank again Majumder and Youngju for putting this on. And I do want to say that the II runs on staff as a renewable energy. And more than many other places I've worked. So I want to say a special thank you for the staff who've been involved in the centers for making this happen, including thanks for letting me put up this picture just now at the last minute. So thank you very much. Welcome. I really look forward to the events. And I think one of you is coming up next. Anne is coming up next. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Anne Lin, and I am the Lieberthal-Rogel Professor of Chinese Studies and an Associate Professor in the Ford School of Public Policy. On behalf of Joseph Lam, who is the Director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies this year, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's conference. China and India, of course, are two of the world's oldest civilizations, two of the world's largest economies, and the two countries in the world with the largest populations. Their geographical position in Asia positions them at the center of almost every conflict. And they both have large and growing diaspora communities here in the United States. And yet it is astounding how seldom India and China are considered together, either by American policymakers or by American scholars. Perhaps it's because, as Johannes was saying, Americans are used to this unipolar world where we're the central actors, or a bipolar world where America faces an adversarial power. We don't quite know how to think of ourselves in a multipolar arrangement where more than two major nations operate and influence one another. So today's conference is an effort to get beyond these habits of thinking and to challenge ourselves to see the world from different viewpoints. I want to thank Majumder Lari, the Director of the Center for South Asian Studies, and Youngju Ryu, Director of the Nam Center for Korean Studies, and importantly, the current Director of the East Asia National Resource Center, for their work in conceptualizing and organizing this conference. The East Asia National Resource Center at the University of Michigan is a project of the Center for Japanese Studies, the Nam Center for Korean Studies, and the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. Funded by Title VI and administered by the U.S. Department of Education, we provide scholarships for students to study Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. We put on workshops for K-14 teachers to bring more content about Asia into their classrooms. And we sponsor cultural events on campus, as well as conferences like these, in order to increase knowledge about East Asia in the United States. As director of the East Asia National Resource Center, Youngju has created a multi-year series of events called Asia in the Headlines, which today's event is part of. And here I also want to thank Lynette Clementson, the director of the University of Michigan Wallace House and the Knight-Wallace House Journalism Fellows Program, which has been our great collaborator in the Asia in the Headline series. Lynette's experience in and love for Asia has really made her a wonderful resource and partner for East Asia on campus. So with that, let me turn to our first panel, U.S.-India Relations in Trump 2.0, and Madhumita is going to come up and introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Anne and Johannes. I'm so excited to see all of you here and to understand what exactly is about to happen on Monday, which I feel like our panelists are uniquely suited to do. As Anne was mentioned, I'm Madhumita Lahiri. I'm the director for the Center for South Asian Studies. And Asia in the Headlines began 3 years ago, as Anne mentioned, as a collaborative effort between our centers and the Wallace House for Journalists with funding from the Department of Education. And one of the visions for this project is precisely that the university, we are so good at so many things, at kind of putting things in context, at giving you deep historical and sociological and political understanding. We are not that good at telling you what's going on right now. And so so this allows us to think about exactly where the interface between academic work and kind of public work, journalistic work can happen. And in thinking about that interface, I think part of what we're doing here is a kind of public humanities project, right? Like, what can the university bring to a larger public conversation when we bring that public conversation into our own spaces? And so thank you for joining us in person and also on Zoom. In conceptualizing this, though, I'm mainly up here to thank I'm in the English department, so the genius behind this project, both in terms of the idea, but also in terms of just making it happen, and that is Kunāl Majumder, who is here this year. We're very lucky to have him as one of the Wallace House Fellows. And I will introduce him, and then he'll introduce our two speakers for the first panel. So Kunāl Majumder serves as the India representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists, where he documents and researches press freedom issues and advocates for journalist safety. Additionally, he advises Impulse Model Press Lab, which supports reporters covering human trafficking, and he served as a visiting faculty member at the Mass Communication Research Center at Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. Majumder has held leadership positions in news organizations, including Tehelka, Indian Express Group, Rajasthan Patrika Group, and Z Media Corporation. Recognized with the UNFPA Ladli Award for Gender Sensitivity and the Statesman Award for Rural Development, Majumdar's reporting spans politics, business, foreign affairs, human rights, culture, and conflict. So please join me in welcoming Kunāl.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Madhumita, for that introduction. Good morning, and welcome to this session of Asia in Headlines Symposium. So this year, as you all know, that the symposium is focusing on the changing dynamics of the United States relationship with two key Asian powers, India and China, under the term of President-elect Donald J. Trump. Now, in just 3 days, Mr. Trump will be sworn in as the 47th president of US, kicking off his second term. Mr. Trump's first term was nothing short of dramatic. He brought about a mix of unpredictability and pragmatism to the US foreign policy, shaking up alliances and competitors alike. For India, the Trump years saw a stronger partnership, especially in defense and trade. Who can forget the Howdy Modi rally in Texas, or the growing alignment in Indo-Pacific, including the formation of Quad, bringing US, Australia, Japan, and India together as a strategic grouping of democracies, was a landmark move in the region. And we're going to discuss more about Indo-Pacific in the final roundtable. Now, while we say India-US relationship enjoys bipartisan support, Trump's famously transactional approach raises fresh questions. Will the partnership stay on track, or will his priorities shift? And how will this second term be compared to Biden's tenure? On the Indian side, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is expected to attend Mr. Trump's inauguration on Monday, a sign of how seriously both countries take this partnership. But there is still a lot to unpack. Now, what exactly does the US want from India, especially in South Asia, Asia Pacific, and the larger global South? What about India's multi-alignment strategy? That's a talk that's from non-alignment to multi-alignment that we've been hearing, especially in the last 5 years, a lot, including its balancing act on Russia. Will Trump's administration push India to pick up a side, or will it accept India's independent foreign policy approach? And then there's the domestic side of things in the US as well as in India. Some sections of Trump's MAGA base have at times used xenophobic rhetorics against Indian immigrant tech workers. Given how critical the Indian diaspora is to the India-US relationship, how might this impact relations between these two countries? And let's also not ignore the elephant in the room. That's Mr. Trump and Prime Minister Modi have strong nationalistic base. While there is similarities, tensions could rise, especially given India's treatment of Christian minorities. Criticism of Mr. Modi's domestic policies have largely focused on the treatment of Muslim minorities so far, but with Trump's evangelical base in picture, will this shift focus to Christian communities in India? Could Mr. Trump use such issues as bargaining chip in negotiation with India? And finally, the Sikh separatist issue. Allegation of assassination attempt on US soil has raised serious questions about how India manages separatist challenges abroad. With high-level report on this recently submitted by the Indian government, how might this influence Trump's approach to India in his second term? So to help us navigate these questions, we have two excellent speakers with us. Both flew in from DC yesterday. Seema Sirohi is Washington-based columnist of The Economic Times, India's largest business daily. She writes on foreign policy and India's place in the world. She has covered India-US relations for more than 3 decades, tracking their progress through different administrations. Her critically acclaimed book, Friends with Benefit, India-US Story, gives an account of growth and complexities of what can be called one of the most consequential partnerships of 21st century. I personally read the book, and I would recommend anyone who would be interested in knowing more about India-US relationship. Seema has also reported from Rome, Vienna, Jerusalem, Islamabad, and New Delhi. She has published opinion pieces in LA Times, Christian Science Monitor, Baltimore Sun, and has appeared on BBC, NDTV, India Today, CNN, NPR as commentators. Her first book, Sita's Curse, Story of Dowry Victims, was published in 2003. And in fact, when I was looking for your book, the second book, I found the first one in UMich Library. We have to request for the second one to be added. Coming to Michael Kugelman is the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center in DC. He's also a columnist for foreign policy and writes the South Asia Brief, a weekly newsletter of analysis on the region. He has been at the Wilson Center for nearly 2 decades and has managed a South Asia portfolio since 2007. His current project focuses on South Asia and multilateralism, shifting geopolitics in South Asia, and US-India tech cooperation. His work has featured in news outlets including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, CNN, NPR, among other outlets in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan, according to a very famous Indian journalist whom I watched recently, namely Karan Thapar interviewing Michael. According to Karan Thapar, and I kind of agree, he's the best person in DC to tell you what's going on in Delhi. So we're looking forward to hearing from Michael. Now here's how we're going to proceed. I'll invite each of the speakers to give their opening remarks. Each speaker will have around about 15 minutes. We can go 5 minutes up and down to share their thoughts. After that, we'll move to Q&A sessions. I will prioritize questions from the audience, and I might also ask a few questions during the session to help deepen the conversation. This way, we will ensure an engaging and interactive session. So let's get started. I invite Seema, who would prefer to sit and give her opening remarks. Over to you, Seema.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Lahiri and Kunāl, for inviting me. It's an absolute honor to be here. One has heard about the Ann Arbor campus forever, so I finally get to come here. I feel it's a privilege. So let's go straight to the topic. The question before us is what a second Trump administration might mean for India. The first point to note that is that India is not overly anxious and feels quite confident that the upward trend in the relationship will continue. Relations have improved steadily under 5 different presidents: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. Today, India and the US are working together in almost every domain, thanks to the value both Republicans and Democrats see in the partnership. In other words, as Kunāl said, India enjoys bipartisan support in Washington, which is a very rare thing these days, as you all know. To get a sense of how India might fare in Trump 2.0, let's look back briefly at what happened in the first Trump administration. Turns out that India and the US managed their relations quite well and with a certain finesse. Despite Trump's unpredictability and his tendency to outrage occasionally, diplomats on both sides worked under the radar and kept advancing the bilateral agenda. And I called it stealth diplomacy in my book because, many things didn't reach the table, Trump's table. The two sides just kept working and things kept happening. I remember India's Foreign Minister, S. Jaishankar, who was then Foreign Secretary, meaning the top diplomat, famously said, "Don't demonize Trump, analyze him." Indian officials and politicians refrain from any ostentatious criticism of Trump. They chose not to react to every outrageous statement he made, except for the most egregious. Even then, they chose to explain India's position rather than comment on Trump's language or what he said. I think that was very smart. It also helped that Trump and Prime Minister Modi enjoyed a good relationship. One might say even a warm relationship. Trump attended a big rally for Modi in 2019 in Texas. And a year later, Trump went to India for a rally that Modi had organized for him. It was called Namaste Trump. I think that was clever diplomacy and it paid dividends. Much was achieved despite the differences and acrimony over trade. Trump authorized the sale of Predator drones to India. These are armed drones, high-altitude drones for sort of surveilling the large ocean area around India. The Obama administration had said no to armed drones. They said you can buy regular drones, but not those that are armed. So finally, Trump gave permission, and the deal was concluded by the Biden administration last year for 31 drones and for $4 billion. Number 2, Trump approved a special status for trade for India. It's called STA1 status, which allows for sale of technology to India that's on par with NATO members. Third, during the India-China border conflict in 2020, the US shared vital real-time information and leased 2 drones to the Indian Navy and sent much needed high altitude clothing, because India had to deploy thousands of soldiers suddenly to deter China from further making incursions. Then, the fourth point, the Trump administration revived the Quad grouping, which includes India, Australia, Japan, and the US. Modi embraced the idea because of China's increasingly aggressive behavior. In the past, India was a little hesitant about joining a grouping that is overtly aimed at countering China. But the 2020 clash clarified India's mind pretty much. Then fifth, the first Indo-Pacific strategy was crafted under the first Trump administration. The US Pacific Command was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command to give greater importance to India in a way. India and the US would be seen as like two bookends of this vast strategic space in which China just happened to exist. Of course, Beijing didn't like it one bit. Then came Joe Biden, and he shared Trump's views on China, built on all those initiatives, deepened defense and technology cooperation with India. Biden strengthened the Quad. He raised those meetings to the summit level, like they met at the level of Modi, Biden, and the Australian Prime Minister who, then he fleshed out the Indo-Pacific strategy and made new strides with India as a trusted partner, all with China in the background. So what might happen in Trump 2.0? Trump prides himself for being unpredictable, and no one in Washington or his inner circle can say for sure what he's thinking and what he might eventually do. India is neither an adversary nor a treaty ally. That's something to remember. The US doesn't have any security commitment to India, like it does to Japan, for example, or to NATO allies. So therefore, Trump cannot accuse India of freeloading. That's something that is a particular preoccupation of the president-elect. It could mean that India may not be Trump's primary target, at least on strategic issues. But differences will surface on trade and immigration. From India's perspective, Trump's policy towards China would be extremely important. Would he look at China as a competitor, as he did in the past, and build on Biden's policies of technology denial and shore up allies and partners to deter China? Or would he go for a grand bargain with Xi Jinping, where China cedes some ground and America makes some gains? For India, the choice Trump makes will be hugely important. An assertive US policy towards China allows for a favorable balance of power in Asia, something that India really wants. A softer US policy on China reduces India's importance, for one, in the American calculus, which in turn can encourage more aggression by China on the Indian border. Better US-India relations have acted as a deterrent in the past. I remember the 80s and 90s when the Chinese would tell the Americans India was not important in their strategic calculus at all. At the same time, the Chinese were helping Pakistan with its nuclear program and providing the bomb design and everything. And doing this string of pearls strategy, which is to make friends with all of India's neighbors and kind of encircle India in a manner of speaking. The tragedy was that the American State Department believed this propaganda. But 20 years later, things are very different. The Americans are awake, the Chinese have overplayed their hand, and India doesn't have to explain anymore. Interestingly, I think Elon Musk might be a factor in Trump's China policy because he has huge investments in China. But Trump's nominees for National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Secretary of State Marco Rubio are both China hawks. And Senator Rubio is exceptionally well informed on China and its geostrategic play. Again, it's finally up to Trump, and we'll just have to wait and see. India is preparing for both eventualities and everything in between. The recent understanding reached between China and India regarding the border, where the clash took place in 2020, is an indication that Beijing is also keen to reduce uncertainty with neighbors before facing Trump's unpredictability. As for India, the credo of strategic autonomy, multiple options, and multiple friends, even though the US partnership occupies a very special position, is the most important. This whole idea of strategic autonomy is in India's DNA. And so over the years, India has strengthened friendships with a wide range of countries in the Gulf, the global South, and even Latin America. To sort of insulate itself should a completely bipolar world descend upon us. So, and right now everything is in a flux, and there's huge competition, of course, between the US and China, but India is thinking of sort of a multipolar world, as Dr. Lahiri said. Another source of stress in India-US relation has been India's friendship with Russia. India has been buying Russian oil during the Ukraine war, as you know. That created some serious tensions with the Biden administration. But eventually, they were able to sort the whole matter. Given Trump's somewhat positive thinking on Russia and the desire to end the war, the pressure from Washington on New Delhi might reduce. In terms of bilateral issues, Trump is said to be transactional. You know, he takes this idea of what have you done for me lately to a whole new level. He could change the terms of engagement with India that India has already reached with, you know, the previous administration. So it is possible that the centerpiece of bilateral relation is a technology initiative called Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, which started under Biden and led to some very path-breaking collaboration in defense, in space, clean energy, jet engine co-production. All that might kind of come under some stress if Trump says, like, he wants to change the terms. He could demand more in exchange, that India should do more burden sharing in the Indo-Pacific. India is doing a lot more it did before than it did before, but Trump could say needs to do even more. Or he could impose tougher terms on technology transfer. Or he could just own this whole initiative on technology sharing with India and call it by another name and just go on with life. Democracy and human rights issues, which created some friction during the Biden administration, might recede into the background because Trump is simply not focused on those. However, Trump's Christian evangelist base, like you mentioned, could become a new source of pressure on the issue of religious freedom in India. You might know that Modi's ruling party, which is the BJP, is fiercely opposed to religious conversions. It believes that Christian missionaries prey on poor and marginalized Hindus to convert them to Christianity. The issue has led to violence in the past in India. Then another issue could be this whole allegation about murder for hire plot that came out during the Biden administration. And the case is already part of the judicial process in the US. How actively Trump's Justice Department pursues it would be of keen interest to India. India is trying to do all it can to show good faith from its part. One person has been prosecuted. There's been a full length report on this whole allegation and the plot. The same goes for the indictment of fraud against Gautam Adani, India's richest man, who is believed to be close to Modi. The two indictments caused a lot of heartburn in New Delhi during the Biden administration. As we all know, trade and tariffs will be a major source of friction, but for all countries, India is not alone in that. Trump's America first and Modi's India first could clash. Trump wants the US to become a manufacturing hub again, and India wants to sort of create more manufacturing in India because it missed the bus the first time. So we shall see what happens. They will have to align their interests and see if they can work something out. It'll be a challenge for sure. Then the whole idea about visas, the H-1B visa that you saw that Trump supporters are not exactly of the same mind. So India will make the argument that they are against illegal immigration. They're said to be about 725,000 illegal Indians currently in the US, according to Pew Research. So India will make the point that we are against illegal immigration, but legal immigration shouldn't come under stress. Indian companies have created jobs in America. They've invested $40 billion over the years. And how Indian talent is key to the US economy and innovation. So India will act proactively. I hear the Commerce Ministry in India is already making plans to offer a free trade deal, and we'll just have to see where the debate goes on H-1B, because India could also play a little bit of hardball. In the end, India will face some headwinds on important issues, which will only bolster its belief in the concept of strategic autonomy. The US will remain a partner of choice for India for many reasons, most importantly for the technological transformation that India needs and wants. It'll continue to work on strengthening the partnership with the US, but at the same time, it'll strengthen its own domestic capabilities so it doesn't become over-dependent on any one country, including the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seema. Now, I would request Michael, you want to use the podium? Or yeah, whatever you want. If you want to speak from, all right.
There we go. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kunāl, and thank you, Dr. Lahiri, for inviting me. It really is great to be here. It's also my first visit to Ann Arbor, first visit to Michigan, other than many transfers through the Detroit airport. But it's really great to be here, and I also would repeat what Kunāl had said earlier about Seema's book on U.S.-India relations. If you have any interest in learning about U.S.-India relations, particularly in recent decades, it's a really great read. So I think that Seema's laid out very nicely what we can expect in the Trump era. I'm largely in agreement with what she said, so some of what I say may amplify some of her good points. I think the conventional wisdom is that Trump 2.0 will be, broadly speaking, good for U.S.-India relations. And I think that conventional wisdom is true. I'll offer some thoughts on why I think that's the case. But there will indeed, I think, be numerous minefields to navigate in the relationship in the second Trump era. And I think more than some observers might think. And also because of Trump's unpredictability, we can anticipate some wild cards. And some black swans that may shake things up. So my comments will focus on the conventional wisdom, on the minefields, and if there's time, I'll talk a bit about what I see as some possible wild cards. So why can we safely assume that this bilateral relationship will be in a good place in the Trump era, in the second Trump era? I'll just highlight a few quick points. One is precedent, and this was mentioned before. I mean, there's been exponential growth in bilateral ties for several decades, including when Trump was president the first time. In recent decades, I mean, the bilateral relationship has expanded so much over so little time. I mean, it's hard to think of another U.S. bilateral relationship that has experienced this level of growth over so little time. And I don't think there's any reason to think that trend won't continue. And a senior U.S. official who deals with, who works on India recently said to me that there's just so much going on in the bilateral relationship that it's hard to keep up. And that was meant as a compliment, a praise of the relationship. Second point is chemistry. I think that Modi and Trump have it. And personal diplomacy counts a lot these days in international relations. And I think that chemistry was pretty good between Modi and Biden and Modi and Obama as well, but the fit is better with these two leaders. And this is because not only do Modi and Trump have a number of similar strategic goals and a shared interest in bilateral partnership, but their worldviews are quite similar on many levels, more so than those of Modi and the Democratic Party U.S. presidents that he's worked with. Third point is personnel. This is something that many have discussed, but I think it's worth highlighting. The people, or many of the people, most of the people that Trump has picked for his cabinet include some of the most robust champions of U.S.-India partnership that Washington has to offer. Whether you're talking about Mike Waltz or Marco Rubio, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel for that matter, they're all there. There are a few very notable exceptions, which I'll get into in just a bit. But yeah, I think that if Waltz, and assuming if they're confirmed, Rubio, Patel, Gabbard, Radcliffe, they're all going to be strong proponents of advancing this partnership. Another point, which I think is important to keep in mind in looking at why we can expect this relationship to thrive in the second Trump era, is familiarity. The Modi cabinet knows Trump well because it's the same cabinet that served in Modi's previous term, which means that it was in office during the 2 final years of the first Trump presidency. And I think that this familiarity may provide a bit of a hedge to a degree against the unpredictability factor. Of course, you can't completely hedge against unpredictability, but I do think it's significant that so much of this Modi cabinet had coincided with the last few years of Trump's first term. Fifth point I'll make here relates to convergence. With U.S.-China competition and India-China competition at a fever pitch, the strategic rationale of partnering to counter China remains very strong, both bilaterally and in multilateral settings, like the Indo-Pacific Quad. The Quad has advanced to a great degree in recent years, in great part because all 4 of the Quad countries, including the U.S. and India, have seen their relations with China fall to very low points. And I think that the China factor continues to provide that overarching strategic motivation for building partnership in multiple spaces, certainly defense, but also trade and tech. Sixth point I'll make relates to policy. Now, some would argue that Trump will want the U.S. to play less of a role in the world and to retreat to isolationism. But I think it's quite clear that the Indo-Pacific will continue to be a prime space for engagement with this incoming administration, mainly because of the China factor. And hence we can expect Trump to retain the Indo-Pacific strategy, which of course was his strategy to start with. He came out with this during his first term. And the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy's core goal of countering China in the region, including through the use of non-military tools like infrastructure investment, tech development, this, I think, aligns quite closely with India's own interests and goals. Seventh point I'll make here is reset. Now, this might seem odd, right? Why does a strong partnership need to be reset? It doesn't, but some prime tension points during the Biden era could well recede, providing a clean slate and additional opportunities for more partnership. I think Seema had mentioned the Russia factor. I think that Trump's posture toward Russia, which is much less hawkish than that of Biden, means that New Delhi will indeed likely feel less pressure from the U.S. about its special relationship with Russia. And I'm struck that Trump's position on the war in Ukraine, or at least his stated position, his publicly stated position, it's actually quite similar to Narendra Modi's. He doesn't criticize Russia, and he just says that the war needs to end. That's essentially Modi's position. Human rights and democracy, this was also discussed before, and I'd argue, maybe I'm going out on a limb saying this, but it's probably been a very long time, maybe not since the Richard Nixon administration, when the U.S. had a president with such a staunchly interest-based foreign policy as opposed to values-based. And the Trump administration is not going to make a great deal of noise about issues related to rights and democracy, democratic backsliding, all of that in India, and that will be a tension reducer. Eighth point that I'll make, the final point on this, is region. Trump's approach to South Asia, both regionally and country-specific, should largely align with that of India, or at least it'll align more with India's positions compared to what we saw in the Biden administration. So the Indo-Pacific strategy will likely guide U.S. policy across South Asia. And then if you look at some of the countries at play, the Trump administration is unlikely to want to engage closely, if at all, with Pakistan. We talk about how Trump has picked some of the Washington's most enthusiastic supporters of India to join his team. He's also picked some of Washington's harshest critics of Pakistan to join his administration. I mean, even in the Biden administration, there wasn't really much happening with U.S.-Pakistan relations, and some of the new areas of cooperation that did emerge, things like clean energy, climate change, mitigation issues, these are not going to be priorities for Trump. And also, if there are cuts to the U.S. aid budget, which could happen, that could further reduce U.S.-Pakistan cooperation due to the large portfolio that U.S. aid has had in Pakistan. What about Bangladesh? Now, this became a big bone of contention for U.S.-India relations in the latter part of the Biden era because of the perception in India, in New Delhi, that the Biden administration was not only very critical of Sheikh Hasina, a very close partner of India's when she was in power, but also was meddling and interfering and perhaps was even behind the mass movement that ousted Sheikh Hasina last year. So there's been a lot of concern in New Delhi for quite some time, particularly in recent years, about U.S. policy in Bangladesh. But I can't imagine Trump, with his America First and what's in it for me focus, I can't imagine that he would be comfortable with the U.S. approach to Bangladesh since the ouster of Sheikh Hasina, which is an approach that essentially emphasizes U.S. support for stabilizing Bangladesh, restoring democracy, providing technical assistance to support reforms, and so on. This might sound a bit like nation-building work from Trump's perspective, or from his administration's perspective, and probably won't have much interest in aligning the partnership that way. Not to mention, Muhammad Yunus and Donald Trump are not exactly ideological bedfellows. Their politics are very different. Yunus has harshly criticized Trump in the past, not recently, and in fact, he congratulated him when he won the election, of course, but he's been very critical of him in the past. And I'm sure that Trump is aware of that or will be told of that. I think that the U.S. approach to Bangladesh in the second Trump era will focus on trade to an extent, but it will also likely apply a strong geopolitical lens focused on pressing Bangladesh to reduce its reliance on China. There's not much here that I think India would differ with. And I think that Bangladesh is likely the U.S. relationship in South Asia that could change the most in between Biden and Trump, and I think in a way that would be helpful for U.S.-India relations. Finally, Afghanistan. Hard to know what the U.S. approach will look like. I think this is one of several cases where there will likely be internal policy differences. There will be harsh Taliban critics like Mike Waltz, who probably won't want any engagement with the Taliban. But Trump himself, who of course, he negotiated that deal with the Taliban during his first term, he likely would be okay with some engagement. But I think regardless, the Trump administration will accept Afghanistan for what it is today, and that includes accepting the Taliban, but otherwise maintaining a limited focus on Afghanistan, aside from concerns about terrorism, which I'll get into in just a bit. But generally speaking, I think that the Trump administration will take a don't rock the boat approach to Afghanistan, taking a relatively hands-off role and engaging with the Taliban only when it deems necessary. And this I don't envision this causing any challenges or concerns for India, as New Delhi slowly works to build up engagement with the Taliban. In fact, just in recent weeks, we've seen significant developments on that front. So now, very briefly, talk about the minefields that we can expect. We've already talked about trade. I don't have to say much on this. Trump appears to have decided to make India the poster child of his grievances about high tariff states. He refers to it as the tariff king. He's done that multiple times. So there's a trade imbalance in India's favor, and India's existing tariffs on many levels might not be as high as those of some key U.S. allies like South Korea and Japan, but they are still high, I think, from as Trump would see them. And I think this makes India a top candidate for tariffs. And the latest I've heard from various sources is that India could face tariff increases of 10% during Trump's initial days in office, unless something changes. Two, another minefield, I don't think we talk about this enough, Iran. Trump takes very unconventional positions on traditional U.S. rivals and competitors. He professes admiration for President Xi. He takes a relatively moderate view of Russia. He, of course, met with the North Korean leader. But with Iran, he's taken consistently hawkish and indeed at times hostile positions. And he's said he wants a maximum pressure campaign. If U.S.-Iran relations grow even more strained, particularly if there are destabilizing impacts from that, I think that could affect India deleteriously. India's relationship with Iran is certainly not its most important relationship in the Middle East, and it's scaled down its energy trade with Iran in a big way, almost entirely in recent years. But Iran is an important country for India. Its renewed efforts to sponsor the development of a port in Iran called the Chabahar Port, which is meant to help enhance Indian connectivity, links to Central Asia via Afghanistan, which is a top foreign policy goal. So, and more broadly, given how important the wider Middle East region is for Indian strategic interests, its interest would not be well served by a more hostile U.S.-Iran relationship. Certainly, though, these risks will all be less pronounced if the war ends in Gaza. Third, backsliding, and I'm not referring here to democratic backsliding, I'm referring to the possibility that some of the big growth areas for bilateral cooperation in the Biden era could lose momentum and face obstacles in the Trump era. So for example, tech. I'm quite confident that the Trump administration will want to maintain and expand this key area for collaboration, but Trump's position on tariffs and some of the hardline positions he's articulated on export controls in the past could pose challenges for ISET, which Seema mentioned before, one of the signature initiatives of the Biden era. And another thing about ISET, again, this is the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, one of its strengths is that it's been run by the two national security advisors to avoid it becoming bogged down in the very heavy bureaucracies of each country. But this becomes a weakness, a possible weakness when you have a change in leadership. So if a new NSA doesn't like it, you could have a problem. I have no reason to think Waltz wouldn't want to run ISET from the US side, but these are still points worth pondering. Similarly, clean energy cooperation, climate change mitigation, these became increasingly big spaces for cooperation in the Biden era, especially with the emergence of the DFC, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is essentially a tool of the Indo-Pacific strategy. It took on a large portfolio in India, focused in great part on clean energy infrastructure during the Biden era. And I'm not sure that clean energy and climate issues will be priority areas for the Trump administration, either in India or anywhere, quite frankly. But this may open up opportunities to refocus collaborations in other energy spheres. Just a few years ago, India was actually the top destination for U.S. oil exports. Of course, once the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, that created very new realities for global energy markets. Similarly, there are a few cases of minefields in the relationship over the last few years that some may think or hope will go away in the Trump era, but may not necessarily go away. And so coming back to Russia, yeah, India won't feel as much pressure on this from the Trump administration as it did from Biden, I'm quite confident. But Trump may pressure India to buy less oil from Russia. He may say, buy American oil. The administration may also worry, as the Biden administration did, about sensitive U.S. military equipment entering an Indian defense industry that continues to rely on Russian platforms, given the national security implications of that. Human rights and democracy, yes. So the administration won't press India on these issues in ways that Biden did. But if you think back to the first Trump administration, there actually was some focus on these issues. There wasn't a huge amount of it, but there was some of it. So there was some criticism after India revoked Article 375, which that was what had given India-administered Kashmir its special autonomous status. So there was criticism that focused on the arrests and the crackdowns in Kashmir that came after that move. And Alice Wells, who at that time was the top India official at the State Department, she actually made this criticism several times, including in some congressional testimony. And I echo what both Kunāl and Seema said about the issue of Christian minorities in India. Given the nature of domestic politics in the U.S., there's a chance that you could have some members of the religious right that are elevated to influential positions in the second Trump administration, and that might translate to certain things. I mean, Mike Pompeo was an evangelical Christian, is an evangelical Christian. He was Secretary of State. He brought a lot of attention to religious freedom issues, not as much Indian, religious freedom issues in India regarding Christians, but he did highlight it. Moreover, there are annual reports on religious freedom produced by the State Department and the USCIRF. These come out all the time, or every year. And unless the Trump administration orders these reports discontinued, which I don't think is likely for domestic political reasons, we'll continue to see these reports produced by the U.S. government that have often been critical of religious freedom issues in India, especially the plight of Muslims. And these came out during the first Trump era. Fourth and final reason to expect minefields in the second Trump administration, and then I'll wrap up, is the issue of the indictments that were mentioned earlier. The two indictments, the alleged murder for hire plot, and the other related to Gautam Adani, indicted on fraud allegations. My sense is that some in India may hope that Trump would press the government to slow down these investigations, that he may sympathize with the Indian government's concerns about violent separatists using U.S. soil to threaten India, and that he may sympathize with Adani, a fellow businessman who's gone out of his way to praise Trump and who's promised to invest in the U.S. and create new jobs. I don't know about this, though. I think that the investigations will continue. Trump will not try to slow them down because of his politics. I don't think he can afford to push back against very serious allegations of violations of U.S. sovereignty, as laid out in the indictment, accusing some element of the Indian government of plotting an extrajudicial killing on U.S. soil. And the fact that Trump has appointed a prominent Sikh activist to head up the Civil Rights Office of the Department of Justice also suggests the direction that the U.S. could take on that indictment. It was a good sign just this week. India's Home Affairs Ministry came out with a statement saying that it's cooperating with the U.S. on the investigation. It has its own committee of inquiry, and that it's taken actions against one individual. With the Adani indictment, Trump may see this as something to leverage, something that could be used to try to drive India towards certain policy outcomes that benefit U.S. interests, especially on trade issues. So I won't go into the detail on the possible wildcards. Hopefully, happy to discuss those in discussion. I'll just identify them. One, is, I think this was mentioned before, a silver lining that could potentially emerge from trade tensions. There might be an opportunity to address concerns about tariffs by pursuing some type of new deal. Another possible wildcard comes back to Pakistan. Said earlier that Trump will not want to engage with Pakistan. I don't think he will. But he is concerned, and his administration are concerned about the terrorism risk emanating from Afghanistan, and to a degree Pakistan, in the form of Islamic State Khorasan, which is the largely Afghanistan-based chapter of Islamic State. Trump likes to say he defeated ISIS, and he'll surely want to play a role in tackling its resurgence, especially with ISK showing the capacity to project a threat well beyond Afghanistan. The Pakistanis know this. They're going to try to exploit this and try to propose some type of renewed counterterrorism cooperation with the U.S. They already tried to do this in the Biden era, unsuccessfully, I believe. Trump likely wouldn't be interested, but that might at least entail some rounds of counterterrorism discussions, which might prompt some concern in New Delhi. Third possible wildcard is personnel. We are going, most of the people that he's picked for his cabinet want to see partnership with India, very strong proponents of that. But it seems likely that Trump will fill many mid-level policy positions with political appointees as opposed to civil servants or foreign service officers, including perhaps India-focused positions at the State Department. And this suggests that you may have some people taking these positions that have views that aren't very well informed or that are unconventional when it comes to India. Final point, and I think this is one a lot of people are talking about. What if Trump tries to make a deal with China? And I'd argue that if this happens, it wouldn't necessarily have as much of a deleterious impact on U.S.-India relations as some might believe. I mean, because U.S.-India partnership doesn't only revolve around countering China, and because Indian interests are arguably well served by a U.S.-China competition that's a bit less intense. Happy to go into that more later, but I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I actually wanted to pick up your last wild card, and I know that we're going to discuss more about Indo-Pacific, especially in the context of India-China relationship. So in Quad, India has famously refused to weaponize Quad against China. I mean, it's a fine line that India has been walking. I mean, this is what actually foreign affairs does vis-a-vis social media. You think that, India has like a full-fledged kind of fight going against China, but that's actually not true. India has been walking a very fine line. Perhaps, I mean, either one of you, if you could just speak a little bit more in terms of what is expected, what would be Trump's expectation from India, especially when it comes to taking more quote-unquote responsibilities, because America has famously always, I mean, I still remember, I think it was Vajpayee era, when Bush's war on terror, they asked for soldiers and Vajpayee had to refuse to send soldiers. India has always refrained from engaging beyond a point in international affairs which doesn't suit its self-interest. Quad is a good example where it's kind of walking this fine line vis-a-vis China. Could you kind of expand a little bit more, especially keeping in mind that Trump is expected to be a very inward-looking president? There's a lot of that conversation, whether that's in Middle East, whether that's in Europe. So in a situation like that, would there be an expectation from Modi's India to start taking more responsibility geopolitically, or even be a proxy for in the United States?
I think we shouldn't think of Trump as more inward-looking necessarily. Look at what he said about Greenland, about the Panama Canal, about a whole host of issues. He's taken credit for the ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel. So I don't think he's quite as isolationist as people think him to be. In terms of Quad, the thing is, you're right that India is the one country out of the four that is the least interested in making it a security organization, because it feels that that would be a provocation to China, like a little too much of a provocation. So we shall have to see. In terms of more burden sharing, under Modi, India has been taking more risks. Look at what the Indian Navy did in the Red Sea. I mean, they were helping out the US Navy and other navies to deter attacks from the Houthis. So India is getting more and more adventurous. It's taking time, but from the time of Vajpayee as Prime Minister, things have changed a lot. India totally understands that if it wants to shape tomorrow's world, it'll have to take a larger role and show that it has stakes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Getting into Trump's expectations of India vis-a-vis China, I think that when it comes to the economic competition with China, Trump is going to want to put the push on the accelerator with that. But I think when it comes to the other aspects of competition with China, military competition, for example, I agree that Trump is not going to be as isolationist as some might think, but I definitely think he does not want the U.S. to get dragged into to conflict and war. He doesn't want the U.S. involved in military adventurism. So in that sense, he wouldn't want to be in a position where he has to worry about what the U.S. should do if China is going to be is thinking or invades Taiwan. So that suggests to me that he's not really going to be pushing India hard on a lot of these issues. I think also recognizing the fact that indeed India and China have seen their relations fall to their lowest level since they went to war in 1962, ever since the Ladakh clash in 2020, which of course was the deadliest border clash that they'd had since the war. But India and China they engage. I mean, it's not a hostile relationship. The border conflict, or since the border crisis in 2020, the two militaries have met on high levels, and that resulted in a deal, on a border deal last October to restore patrolling and some other things as well. And they work together in groups like BRICS and SCO and others. So I think that here you may get an interesting inter-administration dynamic. I would argue that many of Trump's picks to serve in his cabinet are more hawkish on China than he is. I think that a Mike Waltz may take a very different position and might want to push more on the military competition, the strategic competition front. But I think that for Trump, his main priority is going to be on the economic competition. He'll want to work with India on that to push back against China's economic cloud, and that could then get into issues like trying to help sort of build on the initiatives in the Biden era with the semiconductors cooperation, moving forward with ISETs. I think there'll be a lot of support for that because at the end of the day, those initiatives are meant to counter China's tech prowess.
If anyone has questions, we have a mic there. I like to give priority to the audiences, and I can keep asking questions in the middle as well. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah, there's a mic in the front by the dais. Thank you.
Haven't used one of these for a long time. Thanks to the sponsoring organization, the speakers, U of M, of course. I've long been interested.
Could you introduce yourself?
I've long been interested, actually fascinated, perhaps this is a better description, with India since my college days. In fact, my freshman year, when I've read a book by the title, I still remember, the Punjabi century. Unfortunately, I haven't been in India for nearly 20 years. So my question to the two speakers is very much to help me catch up with my fading memory. I'm a retired businessman. Ever since my first visit to India, I thought that the main challenges facing the rise of India, at least economically speaking, lies in areas such as infrastructure build-up. I wouldn't say elimination, but at least the reduction of wealth gap, especially lifting the minimum standard of living of the very poor. And of course, perhaps related to the religious, ethnic, and political factors of division, and in many ways related to the deeply rooted caste system. I've been keeping a very close watch on India's economic development with those factors of resistance, if you will, in the back of my mind. And my impression, even though I haven't been to India for nearly 20 years, is compared to China's rise, the speed hasn't been as impressive. And in particular, improvements in, for example, building up infrastructure, elimination of poverty, etc., have been slower than I had hoped. My question is, what is the future outlook of those elements which have been holding India's faster economic development back for at least the last 2 decades, in my opinion?
Thank you for the question. Coincidentally, was it last week or last to last week, the father of India's economic evolution, Manmohan Singh, the former Prime Minister, passed away. Oops. I would invite Seema to answer this question, but before that, I think it's unfair to compare India with China. There is a big factor. One is a democracy, another is not. And that makes a lot of difference when it comes to planning. But there are other factors. I don't want to enter into politics. Okay.
Political motivation that drove my question.
Okay. Let's stop, Seema.
Well, economics is not entirely divorced from politics. We know that. I mean, that's just a fact of life. I take all your I take your criticisms, how India has been slow, but if you haven't been there for a while, there has been a lot of infrastructure built, lot more new trains, lot more new airports, etc. But India is not a match, not a patch on China. And one big reason is democracy. I'm sorry. You want to build a road, expand a road in India, the people who are living on the side will file a lawsuit. And since we do have a judicial system in India, it's hugely backlogged. Of course, your case may take forever to be heard, but the point is there is a process. And in China, there isn't. China can do what it wants. So I think that's a huge factor. At the same time, I do take your criticism that India could have done much better than it has in terms of improving, the healthcare, improving any number of things, because the politicians, there's so much vested interest in every sector of society. They don't allow, they make money and they don't allow things to actually happen for the poor person. So.
Let me clarify. Sure. I'm only interested in your prediction of India's future.
We want to prioritize our guests.
I understand. I want to redirect.
Okay, got it. Okay, all right. Michael, let Michael try to answer your question.
Well, actually, I was just going to throw in a few statistics. I think that we need to give India credit here. I mean, it's the fastest growing major economy right now, and I believe it's now the 4th largest economy in the world. That happened just recently. It recovered remarkably well from the pandemic. And this is not to suggest that India is still trying to do better, and it can. But I think it's important to keep the wider context in mind here. But I think for me, one of the big questions for India moving forward gets to the issue of employment. This has become a politicized issue, unfortunately. There's some that argue that there have been a number of reports suggesting that youth unemployment in India has been at levels that it shouldn't be, given its broader economic growth. There's been pushback against that. But I think that one challenge has been that as India has focused much more on its services industry and it's developed its tech industry, you've got all these new tech graduates coming out every year, but there's not enough jobs for them. So it's like this, these new industries are still trying to adjust to some of the new realities aside from that. But yeah, I agree. You can't answer this question without getting into the very basic difference between the two countries in terms of political system. So I didn't answer the question, but I just wanted to provide more context.
But I also want to add that, and there, I agree with Seema, and I agree with you in terms of there could have been a lot of other steps that India could have taken in order, especially from a business perspective. And credit where it's due, Prime Minister Modi, even though I'm a press freedom advocate and have huge differences with the current administration in India, but credit to him, there's been a lot of conversations, particularly when I meet with a lot of foreign diplomats, that doing business in India has become much, much easier than it ever was previously. Unfortunately, the legacy of the being a former colony, we kind of inherited this, what we call the license Raj, or the red tapeism within the bureaucracy. And it was enormously difficult, I mean, even still now, to open business or run business. Maybe not as difficult in some other countries, but definitely not as smooth as in many of the other developing nations, let's say South Korea, or a lot of people mention Singapore constantly, like how easy it's in Singapore to open a business. It's still difficult, but I have heard, at least in the last 10 years, particularly after Prime Minister Modi's elevation to power, that there has been a growing ease of doing business in India. And there has been a lot of focus now on wealth generation and on business. And for example, we're talking about infrastructure. The most popular minister in India after the Prime Minister is the minister responsible for building roads and highways, Nitin Gadkari. And I would welcome you to visit India to look at the highways. I mean, I live in a hill state called Himachal, which is north of Delhi, northwest of Delhi. The roads have really improved. They've been really improving. I think he has a record number of kilometers have been. Per kilometer, I think, is one of the highest in the Indian history that he has built. And so there is a lot of emphasis now on infrastructure building. We have one of the fastest internet in the region, perhaps in the world, I don't know. Mobile telephony. In fact, I was just the other day attending a media studies class here, and the professor mentioned about how India's, experiment with mobile telephony as well as with digital payment. The digital payment was in fact something which was initiated by Manmohan Singh, but Narendra Modi's government took it to another level. Now in India, you can buy like a small chocolate using UPI with your phone. So cash is like, the whole sector is now moving online, and at a very dramatic and a very fast fashion. Of course, the pandemic kind of accelerated it much more, and then previously his sadly failed experiment of demonetization when he tried to change the notes. So that kind of forced a lot of these online, but in crisis you have innovation. So there has been a lot of development, particularly in the last 20 years that you've not been to the country, but I invite you to visit and look us up. Yes, Jonas?
So thanks so much for your remarks. I wonder, in the spirit also of thinking across borders and in a multipolar world that we were talking about at the beginning, whether you could say more about Russia. So I heard you say that you see an alignment between Trump and Modi around the idea that the war just needs to end. I'm curious, in this same room 2 months ago, we assembled a high-powered policy group that came up with recommendations to the incoming administration for Ukraine. and it was policy, so it had to be, everybody had to agree on one page. So it had to go through apparently a lot of things fell to the cutting room floor. But the basic takeaway, if I interpreted it correctly, was we need to ensure that Ukraine in any outcome is held harmless for a peace deal. And I'm curious whether you see, besides this kind of general policy, we need to end the war, whether you see steps in which both Modi and Trump would be likely to go in terms of giving Putin what he wants, to put it bluntly, and settling for the current landmass, and actually agreeing to that landmass being Russian occupied and belonging to Russia. So the policy recommendation was, we'll probably have to deal with the fact that this land is occupied by the Russians, but we won't recognize it as Russian. And I'm not sure that the Trump administration will take that policy recommendation. I'm pretty sure they won't, actually. But I'm curious what you think, and whether you could say more about Russia, because of course it has knock-on effects, not just for India and the Indo-Pacific, but in the other direction as well, for Europe.
Michael, you want to take this first and then come to...
Yeah, sure. I can't fully answer because I'm not a Russia-Ukraine expert. But I mean, it's very clear that this war is not a war that serves India's interests. And the longer it goes, the more its interests are undermined, whether you're talking about the global economic impacts or whether you're talking about the fact that it encourages Russia to get closer to China, which definitely does not serve India's interest. So, this is not just, the Indian government saying the war needs to end, simply for, just to say it. There's clear interest-based reasons for it. There'd been a time when there'd been some commentary about whether the Indian government, and Modi specifically, could serve as a mediator to try to ease the conflict. And the Indian government has indirectly signaled that it would want to play a role in helping end the war. But I think that I wouldn't overstate that possibility of India playing that role. I think that, first of all, you'd have to get assurances that the belligerents would want some type of role played by India. But of course, the idea here is that because of India's very special relationship with Russia and its relationship with Ukraine, which is fairly good, it could perhaps be a unique actor in that regard. But I suspect, to be curious to hear what Seema has to say, I suspect that India would not want to be front and center, especially during the first period of the Trump administration and trying to bring an end to the war. I suspect that one of the first things that Trump will do once he takes office is propose some type of summit or some type of meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Or maybe Trump himself will want to meet with Putin. I don't know. But I wouldn't overstate the type of role that India might play in this regard, though it certainly would be supportive of any type of effort backed by Trump to try to end the war. But in terms of what terms Trump would be willing to accept, that I can't get into just because I'm not a Russia expert.
Seema?
I would say if you watch the developments over the last 4 or 5 months, it's been clear that President Zelensky has walked back a little bit because he realizes he's also got to see, the reality in its face that Trump is probably not going to approve as much money or as many weapons as President Biden did. So that's one track that's happening. The reality on the ground is another track. The Ukrainians just don't have men to fight the war. Russia is still able to, induct from here and there. Even Indians have gone and enlisted. North Koreans are fighting. So that's another track. The third track, I think, is what Marco Rubio said in his Senate hearings. I think that's the most clear enunciation of what Trump administration might do with Ukraine. Basically, both sides have to make a compromise. The war must end because the whole world is suffering. it's not just the Europeans. The global south is really suffering, and India became kind of a spokesperson for the global south over the last 2 years. In terms of playing a role, India is, I think, one of the few countries that can talk to both sides. You can't say that of too many European countries or others. Nobody is able to talk to Putin because of Russia's own old friendship with India. Russia is more amenable to, I would say, to listening to India and some ideas. There has been some diplomacy around that. Modi went to Ukraine. Jaishankar has been, the foreign minister, has been back and forth also between capitals. So we shall have to just see. I think there is a consensus building that both sides will have to come to some sort of acceptable compromise, because the Europeans also want the war to end now. They've had their fill of playing the role that they did. They know that without American support, they can't really play the American role.
We have another 10 minutes to take questions. Any more? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. My name is Sirohi, and I'm an international studies student here. I'm specifically interested in the Indo-Pacific, so I've really been appreciating this conversation. So one of my interest areas is the Belt and Road Initiative with China, and I kind of wanted to hear more about what your thoughts were about the implications of the US-India partnership for broader Asian security, specifically with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, given that it's increasingly in the Indian neighborhood and in its surrounding areas. So what implications does that have for the region as a whole, for US-China relationships, and also just US-China-India relationships?
And if I may also add to that, now that we are hoping peace returns to Middle East, if you remember the agreement that was signed during G20 meeting in Delhi, which was to connect Delhi through Middle East to Europe, do we see a renewal of that project?
Yeah, a great question. No, I think that BRI, or more broadly Chinese infrastructure investments around the Indo-Pacific, are a big driver of U.S.-India partnership. I would argue that the U.S. has really struggled to, I don't know, I hate to use the term keep up, but the U.S. cannot hold a candle to what China has been able to do with BRI. But BRI has stumbled a bit in recent years. I mean, we started to see more pushback and backlash from publics in countries that are receiving BRI investments, and also China's own economic setbacks, real estate market and all that has, I think, contributed to a situation where you're not seeing the same level of BRI investments in the Indo-Pacific, certainly in South Asia, the western part of the Indo-Pacific that you were seeing earlier. And there have been a few cases where the U.S. and India have actually been able to cooperate on concrete levels to push back against BRI. Very small number of cases. The one that stands out, ironically, is one that essentially is in a bad place now. Gautam Adani, we've referred to him before. He has this port development project in Sri Lanka. And the U.S. DFC, which I referred to before, basically committed to providing a huge amount of money to work with Adani, who's very close to the Indian government, to build up that port. And U.S. officials, I mean, I've heard them say this very bluntly in NSC and elsewhere, that project, that Sri Lanka project, was meant to serve as a counter to what China is doing with BRI. But of course, in recent weeks, Adani announced that he was not going to take U.S. funding for that. And a lot of discussion about why that is. But so I think that's a success story. But the Indo-Pacific policy on the whole, or as the U.S. sees the Indo-Pacific policy, it's meant in great part to present this idea of offering better alternatives. I think Donald Lu, who's the top India official at the State Department, he had used the term a better proposition. The idea is that the U.S. can provide infrastructure support that's more equitable, more transparent than what China does. That's contestable, for sure, but it's notable that the first Trump administration essentially made the same argument. Alice Wells, who I mentioned before, Lou's predecessor, she gave a speech at the Wilson Center, where I work, back in 2019, where she essentially decided to, she was talking about the Pakistan component of BRI, CPEC. And she was extremely critical of China. She said that it's all wrong, it's terrible, it doesn't help anyone. And then she talked about how the U.S. could do investment better. Now, whether that has happened or not is, I mean, it hasn't. I mean, the U.S. has not been able to keep up. But what I'm saying is that this whole BRI thing and Chinese infrastructure, Chinese investment infrastructure has been a big driver of the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy. And ways that the U.S. and India can work together in that regard is something that I think that the next administration would want to look at. But again, it's been hard to keep up with what China's been able to do.
As a follow-up, Seema, you mentioned that, I don't exactly remember a figure, the Indian investment in the United States. Could you share with us, like, which are the areas where these investment exist? Who are some of the big companies? It'll be interesting for, I'm sure, for the audience and all of us to know.
Yeah, that's a bilateral issue. It's $40 billion over the years, and across sectors. Many technology companies are here, and they've created jobs and things like that. But I'd like to say one little thing about BRI. Started a while ago. Now it's faltering, as Michael said, but it made enough inroads around the world, including in the US backyard, that they have built stuff, they have given just straight money also, and they're embedded in the systems, political systems of those countries. Now, some countries have woken up, like Sri Lanka. They realized that this was debt trap diplomacy by China, because the terms of the loan are so vicious. Like you are, the country essentially loses sovereignty over the years. So US and India and others, Europeans, must also join. If there were a combined effort, there would be a counter. But I think it's just a very little bit too small, too late in terms of countering. The attraction of America in the minds of many is the kind of society the US is. But that's, when you're building, China is building a road or building a train track, that argument doesn't go very far. They're getting the train, they're getting the mine, and in Africa they've done that. Even though they take all their own labor with them, they don't employ locally, and there have been protests in some African countries against that. But the governments are just, completely with China on this, either because they have been given certain incentives, or their generations have been given incentive. Even grandkids have been bought, apparently. So this is what one hears.
Yeah, just very quickly to add to that, BRI is fascinating in many contexts. And it also ties into U.S.-China competition in very interesting ways. When BRI was when it first came out, the U.S. initially did not oppose it. It took some time before it formally weighed in and basically said that it opposed it. And that's because U.S.-China competition hadn't really picked up in ways that it did later on. And the India bit is very interesting too. I mean, India formally opposes BRI not because it feels that it's exploitative or whatever, but for sovereignty reasons. It essentially rejects it because of considerations of sovereignty, because it essentially believes that BRI goes through or is anticipated to play out on territory that's contested that India claims to be its own. And this was a formal announcement that was made some years ago. And I haven't heard that articulated recently, but that's been the Indian position for a long time. It opposes it for sovereignty reasons, not because of economic or environmental or any other type of values-based reasons.
There are 5 or 6 points. When BRI launched, India was the only major country not to attend and gave a very well-reasoned sort of argument that you can just access from the Foreign Ministry's website. Those positions were pretty much in a few years adopted by the West. There was an environmental concern, there was sovereignty concern, economic, the way the loans were structured, all that is spelt out in the initial opposition that India made to BRI.
Thank you so much, Seema and Michael. Unfortunately, we have to wrap this up. Both of them are available through the day, so feel free to reach out to them and continue your conversation. I think we're going to take a 15 minutes break and then reconvene for the panel on US-China relationship. However, as we conclude this panel, one of the things that came out for me, and I was trying to and I was just observing how Michael answered that question. He didn't mention Pakistan at all. I think we had Pakistan mentioned once in the whole conversation. And this would have been impossible to have a conversation on India from a US perspective, let's say 10 years ago or 20 years ago, where Pakistan would not have been the central question. This also goes on to show that how, and to Jonas' point, that how scholarship around India from a geopolitical or a strategy level is minimal in this country. Most of it is still very much cultural studies and language studies. Just go to Canvas, which is this website where you can find courses in this university. You will find quite a few, at least 2 or 3 courses on China, but almost none on India. So which also tells us how much of scholarship that is required, especially in the regional studies on India, especially as the country kind of takes far more central space in geopolitics. Thank you so much to both the speakers and to the audiences. I think it's 11:15. Is it all right for us to convene at 11 o'clock? Okay, at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much.